Today is Equal Pay Day, a day to focus on closing the gender pay gap between men and women. According to Fortune magazine, women would have to work up until today, March 24th, 2021, to make the same amount as their male counterparts did by the end of 2020. So to put that into perspective, it takes almost 15 months for women to earn what men make in just 12. To mark Equal Pay Day, the President and First Lady will host members of the U.S. women's national soccer team. You'll recall the team previously sued U.S. Soccer over alleged gender discrimination, with fans backing their support for equal pay. For more on all of this, I am joined by Sarah Foster. She's an analyst for Bankrate. Hi, Sarah. Welcome. Great to have you with us. So the pay disparity between men and women is slightly better than it was in 2019. But explain to us why these pandemic-related numbers are deceptive, correct? It's not as if women's pay relative to men's has actually increased across the board, correct?
That's the coronavirus pandemic, has definitely exacerbated a lot of these longer run issues, and it's also kind of distorted the data a bit. You've seen women drop out of the labor force at faster rates. You're seeing them work fewer positions, and then that's translated into maybe making the pay gap seem like less of a problem right now. But I think, zooming out as time goes on, because the pandemic has really exacerbated these longer run issues, we'll see this kind of balance back out.
Right. So, just to be clear to our viewers, the industries that have lost the most jobs, sort of the service industries or the more, public-facing industries that weren't the most high-paying to begin with, that's where we've seen a lot of job losses, both men and women. But the higher-paying jobs that were easily able to move to either, online work at home, those people have pretty much maintained their salaries. So it's almost, a story of two different economic levels here. But of course, when you dive into the numbers even more deeply, you see that there are other breakdowns, correct? With Hispanic women making the least amount relative to their male counterparts. Is that right?
Definitely. These disenfranchised groups, Hispanic women, even Black women, they face wider pay gaps, even more so than white women, which the conversation does tend to be dominated in that angle. But, you mentioned the service sector jobs crisis, and that's a really big key here. We've seen a lot of those jobs on the front lines of the pandemic. Those are the ones that were cut when the economy shut down. And as a result, it's really translated into a disproportionately more impact on women.
So what is your advice then to women who've either lost their jobs or were forced to take a dock in pay during the pandemic? What are your tips for negotiating salary while avoiding, compromising their salary goals? I recently read an article about, women negotiating their salaries, and it was sort of to the point that negotiating doesn't always work.
Yeah, well, definitely. Negotiating is the most powerful tool, but I would really strongly suggest that, don't be afraid to job hop. Don't be afraid to take on a new opportunity, which research does suggest you'll see your biggest pay gains that way if you feel like your conversations at the negotiating table aren't going the way that you'd want them to. But even, we've seen lots of workers take more pay cuts this year. It's kind of something that's exclusive to this recession and maybe even the Great Recession a decade ago. And that can be very demoralizing, especially for women. But I would recommend, if a hiring manager or a recruiter is asking you to divulge your earnings history, I would strongly recommend avoiding doing so, because you don't want to risk significantly undervaluing how much you are worth.
That's a very good piece of advice. So do you then agree with that advice that in order to move up and get that pay bump, you really have to move around and switch jobs, that it's that much harder to stay in your current job and move up?
It's definitely something that lots of experts do recommend women take on, but that's not to say, don't attempt to negotiate, because this can be your most powerful tool. And another really important piece here is pay transparency. Lots of companies have made better progress in broadcasting how much they're paying employees, but I would strongly recommend that women also talk with their colleagues. Don't consider the money talk to be taboo. Maybe even consider, asking men what they are paid. Really, it's a sum of all parts initiative. And it's really important here that while this is an extremely frustrating and challenging issue that women are facing, they're in no way resigned to the problem.
So do you think that pay transparency across the board and across industries is the way to really get at the root of the problem and eliminate whatever sort of institutional biases there are?
Obviously, the better transparency a company has, the better women are more informed about how much workers are being paid. But I think, it also gets back to representation. Representation really matters, and that's really something that lots of major companies are struggling with, especially among the executive level. You look back at the Fortune 500 list, and just from this quarter of this year, only 41 were led by women, which is a very low number. And so, it's sum of all parts again. It'll take a lot of initiative and a lot of work, and there's still lots of progress to be made. But thankfully, hopefully the coronavirus pandemic has really cast a brighter spotlight on some of these inequities and will lead to more work being done.
Do you think we've taken a few steps backwards due to the coronavirus pandemic in terms of, evening the playing field here?
I think, the coronavirus pandemic is obviously there's no good time for a recession, but what was so heartbreaking about it is that it really interrupted the longest expansion on record. And, we've seen this crisis, it virtually happened overnight. And you're even hearing policymakers, Federal Reserve officials echoing how this is going to take years to really get back to where we were.
All right. Well, Sarah Foster, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate your insight.
Thank you for having me.